My name is Jenna Carver, and last week, my entire life was flipped upside down in a single phone call. It started with my sister demanding $150,000 from my savings, not asking, demanding. She said it was my responsibility to hand it over because I was the financially stable one. When I told her no, she exploded. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 hours later, my dad texted me an ultimatum so cold it didn't even feel real. Sign off on her mortgage or don't come back. I stared at that message for a long time. Then I did the only thing that made sense. I bought a one-way ticket out of Nashville and started locking down every account she had ever touched. Old credit cards, shared logins, anything she once had access to. I shut it all down. By midnight, my phone was lighting up nonstop, 37 missed calls. And I had a feeling the worst part hadn't even started yet. Because behind those calls was a truth I didn't know yet, something that would change the way I saw my family forever. And once it surfaced, there was no going back. Not for me, not for them. Before I tell you exactly what happened after I closed those accounts, and why walking away became the only choice I had, make sure to like, follow, and stay until the end, because nothing that came next was something I ever expected from the people who were supposed to protect me. By mid-afternoon, my world still looked normal on the surface. I was at my desk in the Nashville office, answering emails and counting down weeks until I could leave for Toronto. My savings were the bridge to that life, the reason I had said no to so many small comforts. And I guarded that balance the way other people guarded family heirlooms. When my phone lit up with my sister's name, I did not expect disaster. I expected another short update about her house hunt, another version of the dream she had been describing for months. She always talked about granite countertops and big yards, never about how much debt she and her husband had stacked under all that optimism. I had learned to listen without offering money, to keep a polite distance between her wish list and my bank account. The call connected, and the shift in her voice was immediate. There was no small talk, no question about my day, just a smooth, urgent speech she had clearly rehearsed. She described a house that ticked every box she had ever talked about, in a school district her future children supposedly needed, at a price that sounded miraculous if you ignored reality. The lender was ready, the seller was eager, the closing date was close enough to taste. In her story, everything was lined up except for one missing piece. That missing piece was me. She said they were short by $150,000, and she did not present it as a request. She treated it like a fact, like the next logical step was for me to transfer the money and be proud I had stepped up for family. The way she spoke, my savings were not mine at all. They were a shared resource that had been patiently waiting for this moment. She wrapped the demand in the language of opportunity. In her framing, I would not be handing over years of work. I would be investing in their stability. She talked about guest rooms where I could stay, holidays around a table my money had paid for, children who would grow up in a home I had helped create. Underneath the warm words, I heard something colder. I was being cast as the permanent safety net, the quiet solution when their choices caught up with them. Every detail she painted pushed against the picture I had drawn for myself. I saw the nights I had stayed late at the office, the mornings I had skipped coffee out to save a few dollars, the plans laid out in my Toronto spreadsheet. Flights, deposits, first and last month's rent. A small cushion in case everything went wrong. In her version of events, all of that was flexible, something that could be delayed because her timeline felt more urgent. As she continued, I felt two parts of myself pulling in opposite directions. One part was the younger sister who had always stepped aside, who had been taught that keeping the peace mattered more than keeping her own boundaries. The other part was the woman who had finally allowed herself to imagine a life that did not revolve around someone else's emergencies. The first part knew how easy it would be to say yes, to tell myself I could rebuild later. The second part knew that later never really came. Sitting under the office fluorescent lights, with my phone pressed to my ear and my cursor blinking on an unfinished email, I understood that this was not really about a mortgage gap. It was about whether I was willing to keep living as the backup plan for everyone else. If I gave in now, this would not be a one-time sacrifice. It would be a contract I had never signed, locking me into the role of rescuer whenever their plans fell apart. The moment I let myself admit that, something in me hardened. I was not angry yet. Anger would come later. What I felt in that moment was clarity. I could either protect the life I was building, or I could hand it over and hope gratitude would make the loss feel worth it. Experience told me gratitude would fade, but the cost to me would not. For the first time, the idea of saying no did not feel selfish. It felt like survival. By the time evening settled in, the tension had taken on a heavier shape, as if the entire day had been preparing me for a blow I still hadn't seen coming. I tried to ground myself in routine, closing my laptop, gathering my things, heading toward the parking lot. But every step felt like walking into a storm I couldn't predict. Whatever came next would no longer be about a house or a number. It would be about the place I held in a family that had already chosen its roles long before I ever understood them. When my phone buzzed again, the name on the screen was Franklin Carver. I knew what his call meant before I answered it. He was the kind of man who believed leadership in a household came from firmness, not fairness, and he carried his expectations like they were law. I braced myself for the weight of those expectations, the familiar pressure that had shaped my childhood more than I had realized until now. I had spent my early years learning that the easiest way to coexist was to remove my needs from the equation. Whenever something went wrong, the solution was simple. I was the one who had to adjust. If my sister needed space, I stepped aside. If she wanted attention, I quieted myself. If she struggled, I was told to compromise. Those quiet patterns had been repeated so often that they had settled into me as if they were character traits rather than behaviors learned for survival. Standing beside my car, keys in hand, I understood how deeply those patterns still lingered. I could feel them in the instinct to rationalize his disappointment, to soften the truth, so it wouldn't bruise anyone else. But the weight of the past few hours had reshaped something inside me. I was done being the one who bent until it hurt. The call from my mother followed almost immediately after. Diane Carver had always used emotion the way my father used authority, subtle, but just as effective. Her voice could wrap guilt in layers of tenderness until it felt like love, and for years I had mistaken the two. She had a way of presenting sacrifice as an expression of devotion, and it took adulthood to realize that the sacrifice she asked for always flowed in one direction. As I listened, I could sense the unspoken expectation beneath her words, the belief that my stability existed to sustain someone else's dream. It was strange, standing in a dimly lit parking lot and recognizing that the woman who had raised me had never really seen me as separate from the roles she assigned. I wasn't her daughter in the way people imagine that word. I was the contingency plan, the reliable one, the person expected to hold the line when everything else fell apart. The realization wasn't comforting. It felt like grieving a version of family I had wanted but never actually had. And as those calls ended one after another, I found myself thinking about all the small moments that had led here. The holidays where my achievements were brushed aside. The decisions that were made without my input. The constant refrain that family unity mattered more than fairness. Each memory surfaced with new clarity, and I finally saw the structure I had been living under since childhood. It wasn't built on mutual care. It was built on hierarchy. Haley stood at the top, shielded from consequences and wrapped in approval. My parents stood beneath her, reinforcing her comfort even when it cost them. And I stood at the bottom, holding everyone else steady because I was capable of doing it. The moment I imagined stepping away from that structure, the whole thing trembled, And that tremble was what they were reacting to now. Not the money, not the house, but the threat of losing the person who had quietly kept the balance. As I drove home, the city lights passing by in a blur, I found myself sifting through emotions I hadn't had room to feel earlier. There was sadness for the family I wanted to believe in, frustration at the roles imposed on me, and a quiet, growing certainty that this was the moment everything would split open. I could sense it the way people sense weather shifting. Subtle at first, but unmistakable. What settled in me wasn't defiance or anger. It was something steadier. A recognition that I could not undo decades of imbalance by giving in one more time. If I continued playing my assigned role, I would be committing myself to a lifetime of being the solution to problems I didn't create. And that truth, more than anything they had said, solidified the path I needed to take. The night felt heavier as I pulled into my driveway, but the weight was no longer something I felt obligated to carry. It was the weight of deciding that I was done living as the quiet answer to someone else's crisis. The shift was subtle, but powerful, an internal line drawn firmly, without apology. I didn't know how my family would react when they realized I wasn't bending anymore, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It felt like freedom beginning to take shape. Later that night, the quiet of my house felt unnatural, almost staged, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the next hit. My mind kept circling back to the call with a tension that wouldn't settle. Something in the way the day had unfolded pushed me toward a thought I had avoided for too long. I needed to check every corner of my financial life, not because I doubted myself, but because I no longer trusted the people who once claimed they loved me. I opened my laptop with the kind of hesitation that comes from already suspecting the answer. The first account I logged into was one I hadn't touched in months, a credit card I rarely used. As the page loaded, an unease rose in my chest. Seeing Haley Carver listed as an authorized user felt like discovering a door I thought was locked, standing wide open. I had forgotten she was still connected to anything of mine. The realization landed with a cold finality. Scrolling through the recent charges felt like descending a staircase I didn't want to be on. Nothing about the purchases reflected emergencies. There were transaction lines for high-end decor, salon services, and a weekend package at a place only people with disposable income booked. $7,000 gone, quietly pulled from a card I barely remembered. It was not the amount that struck me, it was the confidence behind the spending. She had done it assuming I wouldn't look. She had done it because she believed she could. The more I stared at the screen, the clearer it became that the money was only part of the issue. This was about access. Access she should never have had. Access she had taken advantage of without hesitation. I thought back to all the times I had been told that helping her was just part of being a family, and for the first time, I saw those words stripped of sentiment. They were instructions. They were expectations. They were orders masquerading as affection. I removed her name from the account, the click of the confirmation button feeling heavier than it should have. Filing the dispute for the charges was strangely less emotional. It was a process, a necessary step in reclaiming something I hadn't realized I had lost, control over my own boundaries. But the unease didn't fade when the tab closed. If anything, it sharpened. I moved through every account I had, checking, savings, retirement, investments, scrutinizing settings I once ignored. The deeper I looked, the more I found remnants of decisions made years ago, decisions I now regretted giving away. Old recovery emails, shared logins, passwords created at a time when I still believed convenience was safe. Then I opened a savings account I rarely used, and something in me froze. Under the beneficiary section, there was a familiar name: Haley Carver. Not as a joint owner, but as someone positioned to receive the funds if anything happened to me. The designation was 5 years old. Back then, I had thought I was being generous, helping with wedding paperwork, simplifying things for both of us. I had not imagined it would turn into another avenue for her to assume ownership of things that were never hers. Changing that setting was more than an administrative task. It felt like undoing a signature I had stamped with trust I no longer felt. When the confirmation email came through, a strange calm washed over me. Not happiness, but a quiet liberation I hadn't expected. After locking down the accounts, I went through my digital life with the same scrutiny. I replaced passwords I had used for years, removed old devices from my logins, and set up authentication methods that didn't involve anything she could guess. Each update felt like closing a window that had been left wide open. I hadn't realized how exposed I had become simply because I never expected to need protection from my own blood. As the night stretched on, the weight of everything settled differently. It wasn't fear or anger, it was realization. For years, I had treated access as trust, and trust as permanence. I hadn't considered that people who relied on me would eventually decide reliance meant entitlement. Sitting in the dim light of my living room, surrounded by the quiet hum of electronics and the scattered glow of notifications, I felt a shift. Not a dramatic one, but a slow turning of perspective. What I had uncovered wasn't a financial problem. It was a pattern woven into years of behavior I had excused, softened, and rationalized because doing so kept the peace. Tonight, the peace had finally shown its cost. The silence around me didn't feel comforting anymore. It felt honest. And honesty, in that moment, revealed something I wasn't ready to admit earlier. This was only the beginning of what I needed to confront. The next morning carried a strange energy, the kind that settles in before the truth forces its way to the surface. As I sat in the break room at work, hands wrapped around a cup I wasn't really drinking from, I felt the quiet stretch thin, almost as if the day itself understood the shift waiting to unfold. My thoughts moved restlessly, circling the edges of a suspicion I was no longer willing to ignore. When I finally opened my inbox, the message waiting at the top was from Morgan Tate, my financial advisor. Seeing her name stirred a mix of tension and relief. She was meticulous, direct, and impossible to fool. If something had crossed her radar, it meant the situation had grown beyond the boundaries of family conflict. It had stepped into territory where numbers replaced sentiment, and reality didn't bend for anyone's expectations. Morgan's reports were thorough by nature, but this one carried a weight I could feel even before I finished reading. She had pulled updated credit alerts, account histories, and financial patterns linked to anything with my name on it. What emerged wasn't a misunderstanding or a small oversight. It was a map of choices made behind my back, choices I had unknowingly been supporting. The first section laid out a trail of inquiries tied to large loans, all connected to Haley Carver's household. They weren't requests, they were full applications, submitted with a confidence that suggested she expected approval. Seeing that pattern shook something in me. It meant she wasn't planning for stability. She was planning under the assumption that I was the fallback she could lean against without limit. The next section carved deeper. Morgan had matched recurring payment gaps with dates that aligned suspiciously close to times Haley had spoken about financial stress, but had never admitted the full extent. There were unpaid balances, penalties, and a long string of refinancing attempts that carried an unmistakable desperation. It was not a temporary struggle. It was a system of instability held together with hope and denial. One part of the report struck me harder than the rest: an analysis of spending trends. Morgan had flagged transactions from accounts that were supposed to be separate, accounts Haley had no legitimate reason to know about. The pattern revealed someone moving money with the confidence of a person who believed access was a given. And beneath each line item existed the quiet suggestion that I had been absorbing the consequences without realizing the origin. Morgan's breakdown of risk painted a sharp picture. If I had agreed to the money she demanded, I wouldn't just be handing over savings. I would be stepping directly into a financial disaster I didn't create. Their debt wasn't accidental. It was ingrained. It was decades of decisions made without balance, restraint, or accountability. They weren't asking for help. They were asking for rescue, and not a single part of their history suggested they would change once they were saved. The realization settled with a heaviness that felt both painful and enlightening. I had spent years convincing myself that my sister's carelessness was youthful optimism, that my parents' enabling was misguided affection. Morgan's report stripped away those illusions. It wasn't optimism. It wasn't affection. It was a structure built on the assumption that I would carry the consequences because I always had. As I scrolled to the final summary, something inside me crystallized. Morgan had listed projected outcomes if I continued supporting them: delayed career plans, compromised savings, long-term financial vulnerability. Seeing my future laid out so bluntly sharpened my thoughts into something painfully clear. My family wasn't protecting my future. They weren't even considering it. They were treating my stability as an extension of their comfort. In that moment, the story of my life shifted. I was no longer looking at a request for support. I was looking at a blueprint of dependency designed around the idea that I did not get to choose myself. Every number in Morgan's report, every debt line, every risk projection revealed the truth I had avoided naming. Helping them again would not save them. It would only destroy me. Sitting at my desk, the office noise fading into a distant hum, I felt a calm certainty settle over me. It wasn't dramatic or angry. It was clarity shaped by evidence. The situation wasn't about love or loyalty. It was about survival. Mine. And as painful as it was, the report made one thing undeniable. Whatever came next, stepping away wasn't abandonment. It was the first real act of self-protection I had ever allowed myself. By late afternoon, the pressure in the air felt thicker, as if every hour had been quietly arranging itself toward an inevitable confrontation. I tried focusing on work, hoping routine would steady me, but my thoughts drifted with a heaviness I couldn't shake. The truth I had uncovered wasn't something I could ignore anymore, and as my phone buzzed again, I sensed that whatever waited behind the screen would push everything over the edge. The message wasn't from my sister this time, it was from Franklin Carver, and the tone carried a certainty he rarely hid. Seeing his name triggered a familiar tightening in my chest, the instinctive reaction of someone who had been conditioned to fall in line long before she understood what obedience cost. In his world, choices were simple. You did what was expected, and questioning those expectations was seen as disloyal. What settled in after reading his message wasn't shock, it was recognition. This was the same pattern I had lived through countless times: authority packaged as guidance, obligation disguised as family duty. Only now, the stakes were clearer. The demand wasn't rooted in concern or fairness. It was rooted in the fear of losing control over someone who had always absorbed the fallout without protest. A second notification appeared soon after, this time from Diane Carver, and the familiar mix of warmth and guilt threaded through her words. She had a practiced way of presenting emotional pressure as connection, weaving concern into a narrative that left me responsible for everyone's stability except my own. Reading her message, I felt the old instinct stir, the urge to soothe, to explain, to compromise. But beneath that instinct was a realization I could no longer ignore. Every compromise I had made had become the foundation for the expectations they now felt entitled to. For years, I had believed that family unity justified personal sacrifice, that silence kept the peace, that minimizing my needs made me easier to love. But as I stood at a crossroads shaped by their demands, something in me refused to repeat the pattern. I had spent too long pretending that giving in was harmless, when all it had done was teach them that my boundaries were optional. The shift inside me didn't feel rebellious. It felt like stepping into clarity I should have reached sooner. I left work early, needing space to breathe. Sitting alone in my car, I sifted through memories that surfaced with uncomfortable precision, moments where I had been pushed aside, minimized, or expected to step in without hesitation. They weren't isolated events. They were pieces of a long-standing structure I had been carrying on my shoulders without even realizing its weight. I understood then that their urgency wasn't about financial survival. It was about maintaining a dynamic that had always benefited them. My refusal wasn't a single boundary. It was a disruption to the entire system they had built around my compliance. Driving home, I felt the tension settle into something sharper. Their messages had not been pleas. They had been directives. They believed they were entitled to my future, my stability, and the plans I had built for myself. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that the ultimatum was never really a request. It was an expectation delivered with the confidence of people who assumed I would fold, because folding was what I had always done. But something had changed. I had changed. When I pulled into my driveway, the decision waiting for me wasn't difficult. I wasn't choosing between family and independence. I was choosing between repeating a cycle that had drained me for years or stepping into a life where my decisions finally belonged to me. Inside the house, I moved with a steadiness that surprised me. I retrieved the travel folder I kept in a drawer, opened my laptop, and reviewed the flight options I had researched weeks earlier. Toronto had always been the plan, a place to rebuild, to start over, to grow without being pulled backward by expectations I never agreed to carry. But until that moment, booking the flight had felt like a distant intention. Now it felt like the only path that made sense. As I selected the one-way ticket, my chest tightened. Not from fear, but from the unfamiliar sensation of choosing myself without apology. The confirmation screen appeared, and for the first time in years, I felt a quiet strength settle where guilt used to live. This wasn't running away. It wasn't retaliation. It was the recognition that my life was no longer something I was willing to negotiate. When the email arrived, sealing the decision, the shift inside me solidified. I had taken the first step away from the structure that had defined my role for so long. Whatever waited on the other side, I knew one thing with certainty. This choice was mine. And for the first time, mine alone. The quiet that followed carried a different weight, the kind that settles only after every rope tying you to the past has finally snapped. I remember standing in the small rental I found in Oak Park, surrounded by half-open boxes, realizing how strangely steady I felt. My family had spent years insisting that choosing myself was reckless, yet the stillness inside me felt like the first honest thing in a long time. News about Haley reached me sooner than I expected. It came through a financial alert tied to an old shared account I'd forgotten I was still monitoring. Her credit score had dropped sharply, pulled down by late payments and a maxed-out balance she could no longer roll on to anyone else. She had grown used to reaching into places she didn't own. My accounts, my opportunities, my life. And now every consequence finally landed on her shoulders. I didn't feel satisfaction, just clarity. People don't change because you beg them to. They change when the floor they built under themselves finally gives way. Franklin's downfall was quieter, but deeper. He'd built his entire identity around keeping the family image polished, the sort of man who measured his worth by what others believed rather than what was real. Once, neighbors learned that he'd pressured his oldest daughter into signing financial documents she never agreed to. The respect he depended on evaporated. In a town like Maple Glen, reputations don't die loudly, they simply stop being acknowledged. And for a man like him, that silence is a heavier punishment than any argument I could have ever thrown at him. Diane suffered in a different way. For years, she wrapped every family decision in the language of loyalty, but loyalty without boundaries eventually becomes a cage. When she realized I wasn't returning, no visits, no check-ins, No holidays shared out of obligation. She lost the illusion that her approval could control the direction of my life. The messages she sent became shorter, less confident, like someone stepping into a room they no longer recognized. I didn't respond. There are moments when distance isn't cruelty, it's survival. Life in Chicago unfolded at a pace I hadn't anticipated. My new position offered a clarity I'd been missing for years. Each morning, I walked into the research lab knowing my work belonged to me alone. No one claiming it, no one reshaping it for their benefit. The independence felt like a muscle strengthening after years of being ignored. I wasn't running from my family anymore. I was walking toward the version of myself that had waited far too long to breathe. Weeks passed before their final attempt to reach me arrived. A formal letter from an attorney tied to the Carver household. It wasn't a threat, just a desperate attempt to transfer responsibility somewhere else. I skimmed it once, folded it neatly, and slid it into a drawer I never opened again. There had been a time when something like that would have shattered me. Now it felt like the closing act of a story I'd already stepped out of. What surprised me most wasn't their persistence. It was the absence of any real regret. Not one acknowledgement of the harm caused, not one sign they saw me as anything other than a resource they'd lost. That realization cemented something I had been trying to articulate since the day I bought that one-way ticket. Leaving wasn't abandonment. It was release. The months that followed reshaped me in ways I didn't recognize at first. Grocery runs without tension in my chest. Evenings without waiting for my phone to light up with a new demand. Waking up without the weight of other people's expectations pressing against my ribs. Peace doesn't always show up with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives in the form of nothing, no noise, no pressure, no guilt. I thought about Haley occasionally, usually when reviewing financial records at work. Patterns of overspending, cycles of denial, footprints of privilege that always assumed someone else would pay the bill. Her downfall wasn't dramatic, but it was final. A denied mortgage, an eviction warning, a shrinking circle of people willing to absorb the cost of her choices. It was the kind of ending that fits the real world. Not explosive, just inevitable. As for me, I rebuilt without looking back. I learned that healing isn't always soft. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to stop offering yourself to people who see you as replaceable. It's the steady refusal to justify your boundaries. It's the courage to walk forward, even when the past screams for you to turn around. And here's the truth I want anyone listening to understand. Family can be a place of love, but it can also be the first place that teaches you to abandon yourself. The real test isn't whether you stay, it's whether you recognize when staying is destroying you. Walking away didn't make me heartless, it made me whole. And if you've ever had to choose between being needed and being respected, I hope you choose the path that lets you breathe again.